Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into a chapter of American history that, well, let's be real, it still shapes so much of what we're grappling with today.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the Civil Rights Movement. But today, we're going beyond the legal battles, the big court cases, to uncover the sheer audacity of direct action.
Right, because you had these landmark legal victories like Brown v. Board of Education in '54.
Huge, right?
Declared school segregation unconstitutional, but actual change on the ground, not happening fast enough for many.
It's like you have this victory on paper, but then reality sets in, right?
Exactly.
So how did people bridge that gap, between the law and lived experience?
They took a page from Gandhi's playbook, Nonviolent Direct Action.
Okay, I like where this is going. Tell me more.
It's about forcing the issue, making it impossible to ignore. You're putting pressure on the status quo, right?
And when we talk about direct action during the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, one of the most iconic examples has to be the Montgomery Bus Boycott, right?
Absolutely.
Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on that segregated bus, 1955. Talk about a single act sparking a movement.
Absolutely. It's such a powerful image. But, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, this wasn't some spontaneous act.
Really?
Rosa Parks was an NAACP secretary.
Wow.
Her action, carefully planned, it shows the strategy behind what might look like, a spur-of-the-moment act of defiance.
That adds a whole other layer to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't just what she did, but the deliberate choice, the planning behind it.
Exactly.
So, okay, what happens next? This is Montgomery, Alabama we're talking about. I can only imagine the reaction.
Well, imagine an entire city essentially grinding to a halt because its black citizens refused to ride the buses.
And that's the boycott.
That's the Montgomery Bus Boycott, 13 months, led by a then relatively unknown Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
13 months. Okay, that's serious commitment. You've got to be passionate about change to stick with something that long.
Oh, they were organized. Carpools, ride-sharing, systems set up to support those who relied on the bus. But it wasn't just about inconvenience.
Right.
It was about hitting the city where it hurt.
Their wallets.
Exactly. The financial strain on the bus system was huge.
So you have this direct action making a powerful statement and creating real economic pressure. Did it lead to legal changes, though?
It did. The boycott paves the way for the Supreme Court ruling in Browder v. Gale, 1956. Finally declares bus segregation unconstitutional.
Direct action leading to a major legal victory. Okay, this is obviously just one step in a much longer journey, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Montgomery Bus Boycott was just the beginning, but it was like a beacon to activists, particularly young people, showing them what was possible.
Which brings us to the sit-ins of the 1960s. Now, that feels like youthful energy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Picture this. Greensboro, North Carolina, 1960, 4 black college students. They just want to eat lunch.
Sounds simple enough.
Right, at a Woolworth's lunch counter. But the counter is segregated.
Okay, so what do?
They sit, they stay, they refuse to leave until they're served.
Just that image, the sheer audacity of it, it must have been electrifying.
It was. And that single act of courage in Greensboro, it sparked a movement. Thousands, black and white, joined sit-ins across the South.
And let's remember, this is the South in the 1960s. They were facing down deeply ingrained prejudice, the very real threat of violence.
Oh, they knew the risks. They even held workshops, preparing themselves for the possibility of being attacked, learning about nonviolent resistance.
Wow. So organized, so brave. And this is where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, really comes into its own right.
Exactly. These students were done waiting for change to, trickle down. They were organizing, mobilizing.
And demanding justice now.
Exactly.
Love that. Done waiting, taking their destiny into their own hands. A generation on fire.
Absolutely. And that fire led to some truly daring actions, like the Freedom Rides of 1961. Now that's a story.
Okay. Freedom Rides, 1961. I can already feel the tension ratcheting up just hearing those words. So what were they trying to achieve with these Freedom Rides?
Well, you have to remember, in 1960, there was a Supreme Court ruling, Boynton v. Virginia. It outlawed segregation in interstate bus terminals.
Okay, so another win in the courts.
Right. But the Freedom Rides, they were about putting that ruling to the test.
So it's about making sure the law actually translates into real-life change on the ground.
Exactly. And it was incredibly bold. I mean, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, organized these bus trips. They were going through the heart of the South.
Wow. Okay, so not exactly Not exactly a casual road trip.
No, not at all. And they made sure to have black and white activists riding side by side, a very direct challenge.
I bet. Talk about putting yourself on the line for what you believe in. What kind of reception did they get? I mean, this is the Deep South we're talking about.
You're right, and these riders faced horrific violence. The bus firebombed in Anniston, Alabama is just one example.
I remember seeing photos of that, the burning bus. It's still such a powerful, it's a gut punch. Even now, it makes you realize the conviction these activists had, risking their lives just to sit next to someone on a bus.
It's hard to fathom the courage it took to board those buses. And Anniston, that wasn't an isolated incident. There was mob violence in Birmingham, Montgomery, often with the police either looking the other way or actively participating.
It's a stark reminder that even when you have these legal victories, like you said, on paper, it doesn't necessarily translate to safety or justice in reality. Did these acts of violence, did they deter the freedom riders?
Not at all. They persisted, and their bravery, the sheer visibility of the violence, it forced the Kennedy administration's hand.
So they were pushing the government to actually enforce its own laws. The world was watching.
Precisely. The pressure was immense. Eventually, the Interstate Commerce Commission, they issued regulations enforcing desegregation on interstate buses.
Another win for direct action. So, okay, we're talking about courtrooms, fiery front lines. These activists were relentless. It wasn't just about buses and lunch counters, though, was it? They were fighting for something much, much bigger.
Absolutely. It was about dismantling this entire system of segregation. And that meant tackling these broader issues of equality and justice, which, brings us to the marches, the mass demonstrations, these really united people from all walks of life.
March on Washington.
Yes, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, a pivotal moment.
250,000 people marching on Washington, demanding equal rights and economic justice. I mean, Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, it's etched in our collective memory.
Yeah.
But what were their specific demands? I mean, it was more than just a symbolic act, right?
Oh, absolutely. They had a very clear list of demands. Passage of meaningful civil rights legislation, a federal law prohibiting discrimination in employment, the desegregation of all public schools, a program to train and place unemployed workers, just to name a few. They were coming with a plan.
Wow, I actually didn't realize they had such concrete demands. It really elevates it beyond, like I said, a purely symbolic act. They were ready to sit down at the table and hash things out.
Absolutely. And you also have to factor in the media's role at this time. This is 1963, right? So those images of this massive, diverse crowd beamed into living rooms across the country, the impact was undeniable.
The power of visual storytelling. I bet those images did more to shift public opinion than any speech or article could.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about words anymore. It was about the raw emotion, the humanity on display. And it wasn't just happening in America. The international media was watching too.
Okay, so we've got this perfect storm brewing. Direct action, legal battles, this growing media groundswell. How did those in power react? I mean, they couldn't exactly ignore this, could they? They couldn't ignore it, could they? With the whole world watching, how did those in power respond to this incredible wave of activism?
It's important to remember that those in power, it wasn't some monolithic group, right?
Right, of course.
You had those who resisted change tooth and nail, but then there were those who I think were genuinely moved by the movement.
Who saw the need for progress.
Exactly. It's like that saying, what is it? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But sometimes it takes people pushing on it,
Yeah, to really get it to bend. Were there moments where you really felt that pressure, where the government's hand was forced?
Absolutely. The Little Rock Nine.
Oh, wow, yeah.
1957.
Yeah.
President Eisenhower has to send in federal troops to enforce school desegregation. Little Rock Central High School.
Those images are seared into our memory,
Absolutely.
Those 9 black students just trying to go to school. And it took the President of the United States to uphold the law.
It's a really stark example of, the federal government having to step in and enforce what should have been happening already.
And let's not forget, President Kennedy's initial reluctance, I guess you could say, to fully support the Freedom Riders. He was worried about, alienating Southern politicians.
He was a political tightrope.
But that violence, it became impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he had to act. He had to enforce federal law.
Yeah, he had to be on the right side of history.
It's interesting. There's this pattern, isn't there? Like direct action. It forces those in power to actually, to confront injustice. even when it's politically uncomfortable.
Absolutely. These activists were incredibly strategic. They were shaping events, not just reacting to them.
Right. It's inspiring, but also it's a little sobering, isn't it? Because it shows that change, it's rarely a straight line.
Never. It's messy, it's complicated, and it requires constant pressure. And, it's also important to remember that even within the Black community, these direct actions, they weren't universally supported.
Oh, interesting. So there were different perspectives even within the movement itself.
Absolutely. There were debates about tactics, about, how best to achieve equality.
I mean, that makes sense.
Right, because some felt that nonviolent direct action was too passive, not confrontational enough. Others worried about alienating potential allies. There's no one right way to fight for justice.
Exactly. Different approaches resonate with different people at different times.
Yeah.
But despite those internal differences, there was this common goal, right?
Absolutely. Dismantling segregation, achieving full equality, even if they disagreed on the best way to get there. And ultimately, I think the legacy of these direct actions, it's undeniable.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you could draw a straight line from these actions to things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Absolutely.
They were shaping the very laws of the land.
And their legacy, I think, continues to resonate. Even today, think about the Black Lives Matter movement, the fight for LGBTQ plus rights, even, climate activism. They all draw inspiration tactics from this era.
It's amazing, isn't it? To see how these actions are still shaping how we fight for a more just, a more equitable world.
It shows the power of courage, of commitment.
It's that reminder that we all have a role to play, right? Like change rarely happens from the sidelines. It takes guts. It takes a willingness to act, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. What resonates with you? What makes you want to stand up and be heard? Because who knows, your actions, however small they might seem, might just inspire the next wave of changemakers.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.